Away for recording. All right, and welcome to Safety in Small Libraries, presented by Kate Laughlin, who is the current Executive Director of the Association for Rural and Small Libraries. Kate has worked in service and management for more than 30 years. Most of those years were spent working in or with libraries on the front lines in circulation and reference provision, branch management, staff training, strategic planning, and association management. Kate has a passion for service excellence and the furthering of libraries and their missions. But before going rogue in 2007, Kate was the staff training coordinator for the Seattle Public Library in Seattle, Washington, where she and her team trained over 700 staff in crisis intervention safety training. Since then, she has trained in and consulted with many dozens of libraries, including a year spent offering safety training in small and rural libraries around Washington state on behalf of the state library. Kate then went on to serve as the continuing education coordinator and then director for the Washington Library Association. She has also worked with the National Association for Rural and Small Libraries, that's ARSL, since early 2018 and became its first ever executive director in January of 2020. She is a joy and a pleasure to work with. I'm so glad we have her here. And again, welcome to Kate Laughlin. One more reminder for those who have just joined us, this session is being recorded for the presentation part. We will stop the recording for questions and answers, but if you don't mind having your question captured during the recording, feel free to throw it in at any time into the chat, and we will capture your questions as we go. And Kate, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. It is a pleasure to be here, although the reason I'm here is not a pleasure. I'm so sorry for the state of Maine and really for the state of our country when it comes to these mass shootings. And I just want to know that I want you to know that Washington at the other end of the country, which is very like Maine in many ways, was really feeling the pain over the last month along with you. When the Maine State Library put out a call to a few of their partners about what could be done for folks working in the libraries in Maine after the recent terrible events, I responded to Lisa, and I don't do this kind of training really much at all anymore, but I do serve in the interests of small and rural libraries, and Maine's got a lot of them. And the Maine State Library has been a wonderful partner with ARSL for many years, helping out on different things. And so Lisa gave you the background of how I came to be able to speak to this topic. And I want to add to that after having worked in a large urban library system and done so many trainings for those folks, including these crisis intervention trainings from a time when I was certified by the Crisis Prevention Institute in their full battery of programs, it was enlightening. But when I went to start doing the training in small and rural libraries, I realized that a lot of that went out the window. Because if you, for example, need to call 911, but the closest responder is the sheriff who happens to be on the other side of the county at the time that you call, that's not your closest help. And that's the reality oftentimes of a rural setting, and that only scratches the surface. So over the course of that original year that I did this training, the crisis intervention training, all around Washington state and only in small and rural libraries, I came out of that with a whole new understanding. And from that developed the safety in small libraries webinar or presentation. I've done it at PLA, I've done it for the state of Washington, I've done it for multiple small libraries, and I haven't done it for years. But when I met with the Maine State Library folks who are hosting this, and we went over the materials, we really realized so much it has not changed as far as these practical considerations. And I will say the number one thing that I recommend for the small and rural libraries especially, but really any library and keeping safe, is that 90% of it is preventative work, the things you do in advance to prepare yourself, your staff, your buildings, your community, all of that. These are the things that will keep you safer. And there's some things you can do during, after, and what have you, but the most effect you can have to keep yourself, your coworkers and your community safe are to do the things in advance. So that's what we're going to be focusing on for the most part today. And again, Lisa and friends at Maine State Library, let me know if any questions come up along the way. You're welcome, just interrupt me. We're going to get started with looking at, oh, for some reason my slide is not advancing. Okay, there we go. Okay, we're going to look at facilities in the surrounding area. And what I'd really like to, by the way, everybody who's attending this will have access to this. You don't have to, unless you like to write down, take notes to help lock in the information. Don't feel like you have to capture all of this. Everything you're seeing will be made available to you. So as far as looking at just your facilities and your surrounding areas, if you are planning any kind of capital improvements, if there's an actual building being planned, even if there's not a building being planned, but you have some flexibility of moving things, would be to get law enforcement involved. They've kind of seen it all. They can look at your space with fresh eyes, look at your building plans with safety and security in mind, and will often make some surprising and practical and totally doable suggestions for how you might alter to increase safety. So consider them, and you'll find that law enforcement comes up a number of times throughout this training. They respond to anybody in need, but the more that you have built a bond with your local law enforcement, the quicker they're going to drive, the quicker they're going to be to get there. So looking at your facility, go in with those fresh eyes. And what are your sight lines like, especially from your service desks? Can you see everywhere? And if not, why not? Is it necessary? Do the shelves have to be that high? Do they have to be going crossways, or could they be going the opposite direction so that you're actually looking down the aisles and there are many fewer hidden spaces? Also, look at the lighting around the building. If a light bulb goes out, that should be taken care of right away, that day if possible. And if there isn't ample lighting around the building, and especially anywhere where you're going to have to, people will have to come and go, staff or patrons, after dark or before it's light in the morning, depending on what they're doing, perhaps some facilities folks or the manager coming in early. Make sure there's ample lighting, whether it's always on or whether it's motion activated. So look for those. Know all the exits, and more important than that, know your closest neighbors. When we're talking small and rural libraries, oftentimes that's not going to be another business or organization. It might be a farmhouse that's just down the road. That counts. That's your closest neighbor. Get to know them. And the time, again, to do that is not during or after a crisis, but before it. And let them know that you're there to help them out as well. Because if you're in a situation where you're in a rural area or cut off from a lot of nearby people, they are too. And so they'll appreciate this as well. Know the phone numbers of those closest neighbors and the businesses, whomever. We kind of already talked about physical layout and sight lines, but think about the exit routes, think about the furniture. And I like to remind you to think about the furniture in terms of coverage, sight lines, as weapons. Things can get thrown, and things that can be thrown easily should be looked at when you're looking at things in advance in this way as potential weapons. And so think about your furniture that way, as a barrier for safety, but also as a potential weapon, and what changes might you want to make. Cameras, convex mirrors, and duress alarms. I will say there's, depending on your budget and abilities, it might seem like there's very little you can do. Putting up those convex mirrors in the corners can be really great. It is deterrent for theft, deterrent for illicit activities in those blind corners that you can't do anything about. But they're rather expensive, those mirrors, and cameras can be as well. But even something so simple as a wireless doorbell that is under your desk and it rings in the back room, and you've worked out a series of codes. One needs assistance at the back. If there's three, we've got a 911 emergency, call 911. You can also come up with codes for calling people from the back. If you call for supervisor Danielle, and everybody knows there's no Danielle there, but if you ask for that supervisor Danielle, the person knows to go in the back and call 911 immediately. So these are the sorts of things that you can plan in advance, in very likely never having to use, but if you need it, it's there for you. Last thing to say about the facilities is, again, the weapon. Think about your service desk. We are such a service natured people in libraries, and you want to be helpful and make things as accessible as possible. And all of that is true, but it's no less excellent service if somebody has to ask you to borrow the stapler that you reach in and take out of the drawer and ask them to use at the desk, rather than having these things sitting out to be used in a moment of passion as a convenient weapon. And by keeping any of these things that they borrow at the desk to be used there, you're making sure they're not going off into the stacks to become part of some uproar. So again, fresh eyes on all of these things. And I'm going to keep on moving if we don't have questions at this point. Okay. Okay, so your community and the local police, and we're going to focus a little more on the police. The community, of course, we get to know our patrons. We do that already. It's just part of good service. But getting to know them with an eye or awareness towards safety. Who are those people who show up on a very regular basis? If you work in a library where there's maybe only one or two staff there, and you have an emergency situation, you don't know who you may have to call on for help. So be thinking about who your regulars are, who you could count on to help route people away from the building, who could run for assistance to the nearest neighbor, who you could say quietly, please call 911 and leave. Any of these things that you might be able to call on them for. You, depending on your relationship with those patrons, you may even want to have a conversation with them and saying you're doing some safety audits, and though it was very unlikely anything would ever happen at your library, if it were to happen, would it be okay to call on that person for assistance, that sort of thing. So get to know your patrons and think about how, in a worst case scenario, they might be able to be called into service. You don't want to put them into danger, but you can do things like having somebody outside saying, don't come in the building. You could have somebody who's clearing the children out of the children's area and getting them out of the building. There's lots of ways to utilize extra hands without putting them in danger's way. And you can partner with those patrons. I do encourage an active friends group. Now, there can be really great friends groups out there. There's also some horror stories with friends groups out there, where they don't necessarily keep to their lane. Whatever the situation is out in your library world, I would do my best to utilize the group of volunteers that you do have in much the same way that I just described with your regular patrons, because they're often in the building. They maybe know a little bit more. You know them, they know you. And in an emergency, dire situation, how might they be able to be used? They can also be helping with perhaps some of the financial ends of things. If you wanted to raise money for doing a convex mirror, for example, your friends group would be a great group to turn to for the financing for that and other safety gear or training, which comes up later. I won't belabor the business thing, but I cannot say enough about the partnerships. It's incredibly important to already have those relationships in place, much like the rest of library work, right? Whether we're doing programs, whether we're, trying to get a levy passed, when you already have built those inroads with your community partners and your neighbors, there's just so much more that can come of it, and they will be there for you that much quicker. So keep that in mind, and especially with local law enforcement. So whatever ways that you can come up with to get them to come into your building with more regularity, do it. The more they come by, they're seeing the space, they're getting to know you, they're getting to know your spaces, they're getting to know your patrons, they're seeing your patrons, and your patrons are seeing them. Everybody's going to be sitting up a little straighter, flying a little straighter. And you can do things like letting them know that you always have the coffee going in the back workroom, and they're welcome to come by and work on their reports. They have to do regular reports throughout the day. You've got a warm building with internet access and some hot coffee. That's enough to get any law enforcement officer worth their salt into your building. But you can also get really creative with it. There are countless examples of wonderful programs that are done with law enforcement, whether it's safety related things, get them to come in and do a series with you on identity theft, on doing a safety audit of your home and your surrounding grounds in your own home. But it could also be story time with Officer Pete. And you get, once a month, there's a different officer coming in and doing story time or doing some sort of program with the teens that has nothing to do with police or safety or anything. It just has to do with interacting in a positive manner with your local law enforcement. So think about the ways that you can bring them in, be seen more by them, have them seen more often by the folks in and around your library. And you can ask for a security audit of your library as is, not just from law enforcement, as I mentioned in the facilities section, but your insurance providers are often happy to do that. It's in their best interest. So think about security audits, whether it's something informal you do yourself using, this presentation as a checklist perhaps, or whether it's something where you reach out to your local law enforcement or your insurance. But I would highly recommend doing a security audit when there's no crisis underway. Okay. So staffing. Staff are our number one asset in the library pretty much all the time, I would wager to say. Make staff's safety a top priority. And so what does that mean? Okay. In a small and rural library, we often have limited staffing. There should ideally never be a time where somebody is working alone. And if you do not have the staffing or the staffing budget to avoid that, increase your use of volunteers during open hours so that ideally at any time there's never someone working alone without even a volunteer in the building, and have those volunteers understand that they are that second or third person for the purposes of safety and not just for the tasks that they're helping out with. And it helps keep them safe too. It's not just about that one staff person. It's about those volunteers who are in the building. It's about the patrons, children, and whomever else is in the building. This is one that I highly recommend. It is easy, and I know from having a time been in branch management before I went into staff training and eventually went rogue, as Lisa said, that the directors will lose sight with will lose context over time with the realities of the front desk. So if you are a director in a library and you don't, on say a weekly basis, work at least a shift at a service desk, add that to your to-do list. If for no other reason, just to keep fresh context of what's going on, to understand the sight lines yourself, to see who's coming in the door and be seen by them. If you have a director who does not do this, make a note to suggest it to them, and you can blame Kate. Say that was a homework assignment as part of creating a safer workspace. Make sure your directors and any administrators keep some contextual knowledge of what it's like working on the front lines in the direct public service. This is one that is hit and miss from library to library. The strong message of not tolerating harassment. As having trained many hundreds of people in crisis intervention, there is a point where they go beyond just, as we called it back then, anxious behavior into more defensive behavior. Once somebody gets into more belligerent or defensive type behavior, we as library professionals need to move out of that kind of supportive position that we typically take and stay in most of the time. We're trying to support and give help and assistance as needed. When somebody is losing their comportment, if they're starting to get worked up, it may be something where you say, I think I'll be able to help you with this, but I need you to lower your voice because we are still in the library and there are people studying around us. And most people, not all of them, but the vast majority, that's the only reminder needed for them to bring their tone down and meet you where you are. And then you can slip right back into that more direct, supportive position with your response to that person. So letting staff know, my point being letting staff know that if somebody's getting to the point of belligerence and all of that, we don't tolerate that. It's okay to move out of that supportive place and more into a directive one where you are kindly but firmly letting them know that, whatever the parameters are that they need to kind of bring themselves to. Somebody goes, if they don't respond to that and they move on beyond, that's the time when you might have to ask them to leave, or you might need to call in support from somebody else. But what we shouldn't do is just take it. We should either work with that patron or that coworker to kind of bring their energy back down and help them get back under control with their behavior, or we take it to the next level if they can't do that. Evening check-in calls. Libraries differ from place to place whether you're open in the evenings, but many are. And sometimes the staffing is lighter during that, but that's also a time when, it's dark out and more unpredictable behaviors might be coming and going through the doors. So arrange for evening check-in calls. And that could be something where you just ask a family member to call and check in with you each evening at the library. It could be the director calls to check in on how the staff are doing each evening. It could be you have a schedule of that, whether it's done officially among the staff or whether you as a library professional taking responsibility for your own safety, make arrangements with somebody at home. But check-in calls on a regular basis can be a good idea, or anytime when you're feeling like it's an unsettled time period, or time of day or day of the week, or it's the full moon like we just had. These are the times to take these extra measures. Again, they'll probably not be needed, almost certainly not be needed, but that's not the point of preventative actions like this. Leaving work. This should be, I would encourage you to make this a policy actually with staff that we don't leave work alone. So if that means that somebody has to wait for the other person to gather their belongings before you go out together to their cars, that should be a requirement, because leaving a building alone at night, especially on out of a public building when you have known shifts, that can be an invitation for ne'er-do-wells to, do what they will. So make it a policy that people don't leave alone. If somebody does need to finish up at the library alone or work late, as sometimes the managers will do, make sure you've arranged to have somebody meet you as you leave the building. At the very least, be on the phone with them. Make sure at all times somebody is aware where you are, that you're leaving the building, and when to expect you. If that's not someone at home, talk to a friend, coworker, your boss, whomever. But really, that's one where you can have really clear parameters and requirements about it, and that could make a real difference. This one's easier said than done. Providing crisis intervention training to staff and volunteers. For example, I was originally certified in a crisis intervention training by the Crisis Prevention Institute, and they still exist and they still have the training, and it's solid training. That said, to be certified in it, you have to pay few $1,000s. Once you have somebody certified in it, they can train the people for you. And there's ways for libraries to go in on that. So if that's something you ever, in fact, it could be something you want to talk with your state library about, whether it's that kind of a program or something else. If you're not able to provide crisis intervention training yourself to the staff or volunteers at your library, start talking about talk about it with your neighboring libraries, because they're having the same issues, they have the same concerns, the same needs. And if you can go to together on, for example, going in on having one library professional trained in, certified in whatever the training is, and then share that training amongst you. There are lots of ways to collaborate on something like this. I do encourage you to keep it within the library field, though, because we have such a unique industry. We're called to such different bottom lines than most, and it helps keep it very relevant and real for libraries. And I mentioned volunteers and not just staff. If you are lucky enough to have ample staffing, and you don't have to utilize your volunteers for anything but very minimal things, they're not helping keep enough bodies in the building to turn to. Maybe you don't have to train them in the crisis intervention training. But if you do rely on your volunteers to be extra people in the building when you're short on staff, if they're very involved with lots of in-depth um, projects, such as any part of public programs, that sort of thing, you might consider training them as well to help keep them safe. It also gives everybody a greater sense of confidence. It's probably one of the biggest benefits of crisis intervention training, is feeling like you will know what to do when that moment arises. And then practice those skills and effective phrases. And even if you DIY, and we do have some resources for you at the end that will be in the handout that Maine State Library provides. There are some places where you can go and just read up on things and do some DIY focused discussions in a unit meeting with your staff and coworkers or with the volunteers. So even if you can't afford a formal training, look for the resources that are there. Find that skills practice and do it. Learn some effective phrases. Work on those code words or the series of rings from the wireless doorbell or what have you. But get that work started, because that's something where you have to be working on it for a while before it's not unlike CPR. You rarely need it, but it pays off. And I know this. I was certified for probably 25 years until the day came where I got to help save someone's life. And it luckily by then had become muscle memory, or I don't think I could have done what I did. Counseling and employee assistance programs. EAP is anymore a fairly standard part of health insurance, but I know health insurance isn't always standard. So if you don't know if you have an employee assistance program available to you, ask your manager or your HR department if you have one, and seek counseling and offer counseling as needed. It can be helpful in doing these security audits and doing the planning, to even to have somebody talk with staff about what are their fears, and where does the anxiety reside, and kind of get that all exercised. Okay, we're going to keep plowing forward. Okay, and hang on, I just have to move this bar. Whoop. Sorry, the bar of tools is right across at an inopportune place. Okay, this is, I think, the most important, because when we talk about staff response, we're talking about us, right? What can we each individually do? And one of the number one things is keep yourself as the priority. It's a tired analogy, but the whole put your mask on first before you assist others is absolutely the case here. If you do not keep yourself safe, you will not be able to help keep others safe. So number one thing, keep yourself safe as top priority, and trust your instincts. If you've got a gut feeling about something or a situation being unsafe, treat it as such until it's proven otherwise. Really pay attention to those vibes. They often are correct. Learn and practice de-escalation skills. And by that, I sort of was referencing them in the previous slide when talking about that behavior model with the Crisis Prevention Institute. And the whole idea behind de-escalation is you respond in a way that matches, that is the correct response to the behavior that you're seeing that is being presented to you. And you match it in a way that will bring the energy back down. You always want the energy being brought back down, whether it's volume, whether it's agitation, I'm going to kind of bring it back under control so that ultimately we can do what we're here to do, which is help people with whatever their needs are. So learn about de-escalation skills. There's lots of different models out there, not just the one I mentioned, and practice them individually on staff teams, and do it again, muscle memory, keep practicing them, be really clear on what those are. Know your policies and procedures at the library, and especially the rules of conduct. If you don't have a code of conduct, that should be the second thing on your, the number one or number two thing on your homework assignments is go back to your manager or the powers that be and discuss having a code of conduct. Having a code of conduct and having clear policies and procedures are just tools for excellent service to begin with, because what it does is breeds consistency. We know that consistency is one of the number one things mentioned when asked to describe why they believe an organization or a business has excellent customer service. It's sort of why Starbucks has done so well, despite I'm not a coffee drinker, but as I understand it, the coffee often tastes sort of burnt, but it'll taste the same no matter how you take it at any Starbucks because of their commitment to consistency. And that translates to our minds as excellent service. So policies and procedures aren't just rules for busting perps. They're tools for giving excellent, consistent service. And for us, especially with the procedures, of knowing what to do. If you've got a policy, which is the rule, and somebody's not following it, what's the procedure for dealing with that? So too often we have our policies in place, but not the procedure. And that's the part where it can be greatly different from person to person, how they handle a situation. And that will breed the lack of good service. It can breed safety issues. And you just want to have those in place. So go look at your policies and procedures, especially anything having to do with behaviors in the library. Make sure you've got your rules of conduct in place, an exclusion policy and procedure. So not just calling the police and having them criminally trespassed, but what can you do without law enforcement even involved? Of saying, okay, we're going to exclude you from the library for a week and then come on back. You have to have a chat with the librarian about your future behavior in the library, and then we will welcome you back with open arms. We'd like you to come back on up to, say, a year that you ask them to leave, which is what if police are involved in a criminal trespass is issued, that will be generally for a year's time. There's times when that's really great to have them involved. Other times that may not be practical, but it doesn't mean that you don't have the ability to exclude people based on behavior violations. Just make sure you've got your policies and your procedures in place to back them up. This is really important for the local services available for those in crisis. Sometimes somebody's having a crisis that gets out of control, but if you were able to look at the roots of it, it's because their life is in crisis. And so the more that we're able to provide resources, show that there is somebody you can go to. This is organization you can call, you can visit, you can apply for these services or these resources, food, shelter, what have you. The better service it's going to be, obviously, but also that whole trying to keep the energy down, bring the energy down. If somebody is very agitated and anxious and upset because they are in crisis, and you are able to provide them resources that will address their crisis situation, that's absolutely going to bring the energy down. And it's just, frankly, a good thing to be doing. So if you don't already have that list compiled, even if you don't get asked for it regularly, that's not the time when somebody's in crisis and needing it is not the time to go, oh, maybe we should have pulled that together for that one person who finally asked. Do it ahead of time, have it ready. Respond sooner. So this is something that we'll often make mistakes with. Again, it I think comes back to that service nature, also our feelings around confidentiality and privacy. You don't want to go bugging anyone, but we pick up on things. We notice something might be brewing. You notice something is brewing, do something a little sooner. That might be just talking to your coworker and saying, I saw those kids were kind of those teens were kind of squaring off there for a minute. Seems like it died back down and they're seated and being amicable, but let's keep an eye on that. And then the two of you are ready to approach them quickly if things were to blow up, asking them to leave or whatever was necessary. But be aware of what's going on. If you're picking up on something, pay attention to it, talk to somebody else about it, maybe even approach that scenario I just gave, those teens. It didn't end up blowing up, but once they're back at the seats, you go ahead and walk over there and talk to them, in a respectful way about, hey, everything going okay over here? If we're going to have any problems, we're going to need to ask you to leave. So let's just, keep a chill energy over here and acknowledge it so that they know they've been seen. Take that action a little bit sooner, so something doesn't grow being unchecked. We already covered consistency. Keep that up and enforce the consistency. It really is for the best. If you are making an exception and waiving fines or allowing someone an extra renewal or anything, those exceptions to the rule shouldn't be secret. They should be out loud and proud, and you let the patron know you're making an exception to the rule. If appropriate, maybe you make a note in the account or you mention it to your coworker. I'm going to make an exception because she's going to be traveling and won't be able to get it back before that date. So everybody knows it's an exception to the rule. That's a way to handle something versus well, we'll just go ahead and do this for you. That's where those consistent limits and them changing from depending on who a patron interacts with and who doesn't can be the catalyst for a lot of drama when they don't get the thing from one person that they had gotten from another person working there. So really, you can't even imagine all the ways that these little consistencies can keep a calmer, safer workplace for you. When there are behavioral problems around young people, don't be shy about calling on the parents or even the school. And especially if you've got crowds of kids or groups of kids who come in from particular schools on regular times after school or on regular days, and they're becoming more and more of a behavioral issue, contact the school and work with them, partner with them on it. We want to have these kids in the library. We don't want to have to be asking them to leave. What can we be doing? How can we be working with you at the school to keep our doors open to these teens and yet have them use the space appropriately and just start the conversation? It could be with the school, it could be with the parents if you have that kind of a relationship with your patrons or in your community. But take action sooner than you might have otherwise. Know who to call in emergency and what happens when you call. For instance, there are some libraries, for whatever reason, you might have to dial 911. If you have to put a 9 in something to have it go outside of the building, and this still happens amazingly, know that and make sure everybody knows it. And if necessary, put a sticker on the phone. If there is another emergency number because of the idiosyncrasies of your rural area, make sure that's on every phone, that everybody who's in the building, staff and volunteers, know who to call. And when you're thinking about calling 911, oh, this has happened so many times, probably to all of you at least once, where you're thinking about calling 911 and you're not sure, does this rise to the level of calling 911? I don't want to bother them or burden them if it doesn't. If you're thinking that long and hard about whether to call 911, call 911 and ask them. And they will tell you. You will not get in trouble for calling 911 if you call them and you say, I wasn't sure whether I should call or not, so I'm calling to ask you, here's my situation. And they will guide you through that. So when in doubt whether to call 911, call 911. And use the strongest accurate language. And I'll give you an example of this. If when you call 911 or any emergency services, that dispatcher has to triage. They have to figure out if there are multiple calls or situations going on, they have to figure out who gets sent where and how soon. And you should not ever be lying to the 911 dispatcher about the situation. But if you were to call them and say, I've got a patron in my library who is getting kind of loud and banging on tables and stuff. It's making me really nervous. Could you come and check on him? They might be able to come right away, but if you called and said, we've got a patron who's having some sort of outburst or incident here, we're not sure if they're on something. They are wielding books and other things as if they might become weapons. I've got some children here. We're feeling very unsafe. Now, you're not being inaccurate. That's all still true. But as you might imagine, that second description would get you up higher in the queue for a response than the first one. Or you were to call and say, we've got somebody here who's, asleep and, I want them to wake up, versus calling and saying, we have a possible OD. If you say we've got a possible OD, boy, they're going to be there fast. And I know that from personal experience and more than once. So use the strongest possible language when calling for assistance, and then debrief after any incident with anyone who was involved, all the staff, so that there's not a rumor mill. If there were volunteers or regular patrons who somehow got caught up in it or witnessed it, make a point of touching base with them afterwards. Make sure they're no, it doesn't have to be immediately afterwards. It could be the next day or the next week, but touching base to make sure they're okay, that they have the accurate information about what happened, that they're aware of what the follow-up was, what the library is going to do, what happened to the perpetrator, whatever the details are that will help them with closure, and also help all of you prepare for how might we have done things differently? What would we do in the situation in the future? That debrief is so key. Okay, well, gosh, I've been just plowing along here pretty quick. And I want to make sure that we have time for questions. But before we end the recording portion of this, as I said a few times, when you get back to work, which might be immediately after this webinar, I challenge you to look in your workspaces, primarily the public spaces, but we're all humans with our various passions and emotions and crises. So look at your workrooms too with fresh eyes. With that, use the handout that will provide you as a checklist for kind of surveying things. What is accessible to people? How might we rearrange things to create a safer, more visible environment? Start building those relationships, or if you've started building them, continue it and start having very specific conversations about safety and how you and your neighbors can help keep each other safe in a crisis situation. If you have questions for me at any point along the way, or if you have questions about the Association for Rural and Small Libraries, which is just a wonderful organization, write to us at info@arsl.org, or look us up online at arsl.org, and you can find our office hours, which is Monday through Friday, pretty much, and a real person will generally answer the phone unless one of us is if we're all in the same meeting together. But we are here to, and it is a member organization, but we're here in service to the entire rural and small library community. So don't be shy about calling and asking for services or resources or information. Even if you're not a member, we're still here for you. So with that, I would like to ask if they can end the recording so that we can accept questions in more confidential manner.